This is Joe Biden. On January 19th, 2022, he gave what was only his second solo press conference as president, during which Biden was asked about H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, two so-called voting rights bills that didn't have the votes to break the filibuster in the Senate.
Speaking of voting rights legislation, if this isn't passed, do you still believe the upcoming election will be fairly conducted and its results will be legitimate?
Well, it all depends on whether or not we're able to make the case to the American people that some of this is being set up to try to alter the outcome of the election.
So, you heard that, right? Joe Biden, the President of the United States, is casting doubt on the legitimacy of the 2022 midterms. But maybe he misspoke.
I wanted to clarify, a moment ago you were asked whether or not you believed that we would have free and fair elections in 2022 if some of these state legislatures reformed their voting protocols. You said that it depends. Do you think that they would in any way be illegitimate?
Oh yeah, I think it easily could be illegitimate.
This is bonkers. What Biden is clearly saying is that there are state legislatures that have put in place laws that will illegitimately affect the outcome of the 2022 election.
I'm not saying it's going to be legit. It's the increase in the prospect of being illegitimate is in direct proportion to us not being able to get these reforms passed.
And again, he's saying that the upcoming election will be illegitimate unless his voting rights bills are passed. And you thought the orange man was bad. And that brings us to the floor of the Senate, where Democrats claim that those damn Republicans are passing laws to make it harder for people to vote.
The most anti-democratic laws since Jim Crow have taken the nation by storm. Last year, 19 states passed nearly 36 laws undermining access to the ballot box.
19 states have passed 34 laws, making it easier to sabotage election law and target voters of color.
Election laws in 19 states that make it harder for people to vote, with a special focus on people of color, young people, poor people, and people with disabilities, people who might be inclined to vote against them.
Right. Now, senators like Bernie Sanders here are getting this 19 states passed 34 laws talking point from the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center claims that between January 1st and December 7th, 2021, at least 19 states passed 34 restrictive laws. The restrictive laws make it more difficult for voters to cast mail ballots that count, make in-person voting more difficult by reducing polling place hours and locations, and criminalize the ordinary lawful behavior of election officials and other individuals involved in elections.
In the past year alone, Republican legislators in 19 states have enacted laws making it harder for Americans to vote.
American democracy is under attack from Republican politicians. In the past year alone, Republican state legislatures have passed laws in nearly 20 states to restrict American citizens' right to vote.
So for clarity, Senator Dick Durbin and Senator Elizabeth Warren are saying that it's Republican politicians who passed these restrictive laws. Except out of the 19 states mentioned on the Brennan Center's list, Kansas, Louisiana, New York, and Nevada have Democrat governors who signed these laws into effect. Not to mention that New York and Nevada have Democrat-controlled legislatures.
At least 19 states have passed 33 laws that make it harder for people to vote.
So according to Senator Chuck Schumer, he's stating that his home state of New York is making it harder for people to vote. Great job, genius. And that's the setup. Democrats like Chuck Schumer are blindly repeating a line from a liberal advocacy group and claiming that there are 34 laws with provisions that are making it harder to vote. And yet they never go into any real detail or explain how these laws are restrictive, because that would destroy their whole narrative. So with that said, in this very video, we're we're going to go through every single law on the Brennan Center's list and see if we can find even one provision that prevents any eligible American from casting a ballot. So break out the popcorn and strap yourselves in, because you won't see this type of breakdown anywhere else. First, there's the accusation that states have shortened a window to apply for a mail ballot. In Alabama, for example, the state legislature changed it from 5 days before an election to 7 days. The Alabama Political Reporter writes, during the 2020 election cycle, the Secretary of State's office, as well as local absentee offices across the state, heard from voters who had requested absentee ballots but had not yet received them. According to John Merrill, the Alabama Secretary of State, in order to accommodate for future delays by the Postal Service, the deadline to return an absentee ballot application by mail has changed from 5 days before the election to 7 days before the election. And logically, having only 5 days to send the absentee ballot application through the mail, have the office receive it, enter it in the system, process it, and send out an absentee ballot through the mail with enough time for the voter to fill it out and send it back through the mail in time for Election Day is cutting it close. With that said, the Brennan Center is leaving out one important detail. The deadline in Alabama for absentee ballot applications returned by hand remains 5 days before the election. In other words, the Brennan Center is being dishonest and not telling you the whole story. I know you're shocked. As for the other states that the Brennan Center called out, Arizona and Iowa have a deadline of 7 days before an election. Georgia is 11 days before an election. Kentucky's deadline is 14 days before an election. And Oklahoma's is 15 days before. Then there's New York, which shortened their deadline from 7 days to 15 days before an election. So are any of these deadlines restrictive in any way? No. Are they targeting a specific group or demographic? No, because there is nothing stopping any eligible voter from applying for an absentee ballot within a generous time frame. Next, the Brennan Center calls out Iowa and Arkansas for shortening the deadline for voters to deliver mail-in ballots. In Iowa, ballots must be received by the time the polls close on Election Day. In Arkansas, ballots must be received in the mail by 7:30 p.m. on Election Day. So let me get this straight. The Brennan Center claims that requiring a mail-in ballot to arrive by Election Day is restrictive. These people are nuts. Next, the Brennan Center claims that Arizona and Florida make it harder to remain on absentee voting lists. And this is a lie. Arizona has an active early voting list. If a voter actively votes by mail, they will continue to receive early ballots by mail. If a voter does not return at least one early ballot over the course of 4 years, the county recorder will reach out and ask if they still want to receive a ballot. If they don't respond, they are removed from the list. In other words, if you aren't actively voting by mail, you don't need to be receiving a mail-in ballot. Meanwhile, in Florida, voters are required to make a request to receive a mail-in ballot every 2 years. And guess what? Requesting that voters do a re-up every 2 years isn't unreasonable, let alone restrictive. Next, the Brennan Center calls out 4 states claiming that they eliminated or limit sending mail ballot applications to voters who do not specifically request them. And so what? If a voter wants to apply for a mail-in ballot, they should be responsible for initiating the process. It's that simple. And for clarity, these laws do nothing to restrict any eligible voter from applying. And the same for eliminating or limiting sending mail ballots to voters who do not specifically request them. A state isn't restricting a voter from voting by mail if the voter never requested a mail-in ballot. Next is restricting assistance in returning a voter's mail ballot. Now, these laws are designed to prevent what is known as ballot harvesting. That's when political operatives go door to door to collect mail-in ballots and drop them off to the local election board. So these laws exist because these operatives can potentially intimidate voters and tamper with or even destroy ballots. And that's bad, right? Anyway, bear with me, because all of these laws are worded a little different. So for clarity, we're going to go through each one. In Montana, for the purposes of enhancing election security, a person may not provide or offer to provide, and a person may not accept a pecuniary benefit, i.e. money, in exchange for distributing, ordering, requesting, collecting, or delivering ballots. And the same with Senate Bill 1 in Texas, which bans vote harvesting services and makes ballot harvesting a felony. In other words, if you're a paid employee or volunteer working for a political group, you're not allowed to handle anyone's ballot. In Arkansas, the possession by a person of more than 4 absentee ballots creates a rebuttable presumption of intent to defraud. In Florida, the law prohibits any person from distributing, ordering, requesting, collecting, delivering, or otherwise physically possessing more than 2 vote-by-mail ballots of other electors per election, not including immediate family members. In Iowa, the law states that the only people allowed to collect and return a ballot are the registered voter themselves, an individual who lives in the same household, an immediate family member, or a delivery agent acting on behalf of a registered voter who is unable to return the registered voter's own ballot due to reason of blindness or disability. In Kansas, no person shall knowingly transmit or deliver an advance voting ballot to the county election officer or polling place on behalf of a voter who is not such person unless the person submits a written statement accompanying the ballot at the time of a ballot delivery to the county election officer or polling place. Sounds convoluted, right? But there's nothing in that Kansas law that doesn't keep anyone from simply dropping it in a mailbox. Problem solved! In Kentucky, no person shall knowingly collect, gain possession of, deliver, or exercise control over a mail-in absentee ballot except for the voter themselves, an election official, a U.S. postal worker, a family member of the voter, a person who shares the same residence of the voter, or a caregiver. But remember, Democrats love ballot harvesting. So of course they're going to say that these laws are restrictive. Next is the accusation that some states limit the number, location, or availability of mail ballot drop boxes. Here's Kamala Harris on the issue.
What is truly at stake are issues like whether a single parent has the opportunity with 3 kids in the back seat to vote by dropping off their ballot in a drop box instead of having to stand in line with those 3 kids for hours. These are the issues that are at stake.
Now, even though you could drop your mail-in ballot in a mailbox, Kamala Harris just said that if you don't have access to a drop box, that you have to wait in line to vote. In other words, Kamala Harris thinks you're stupid. And so does the Brennan Center, apparently. And with that said, we'll just move on. Next on the list are 4 new restrictive laws that impose stricter signature requirements for mail ballots. In Arizona, a ballot will not be counted without the voter's signature on the envelope, and if the signature is missing, an elections officer will attempt to reach out to the voter to get it fixed. And it's the same for Idaho, Kansas, and Texas. Again, each state requires that if there is no signature, or the signature doesn't match their records, election officials have to reach out to the voter to try and get it fixed. How is that stopping anyone from voting? Oh right, it's not. And before you say it, each of the states I mentioned have provisions in the law for people who are physically unable to sign their ballot. So no, it's not preventing people with disabilities from voting. Next, there's the accusation that 6 states have imposed harsher voter ID requirements. First, there's Arkansas, who signed into law a provision to authorize the issuance of a driver's license or an identification card without a photograph in certain circumstances. Those circumstances include if the licensee has a sincerely held religious belief that prohibits an individual having his or her photograph taken, or if the licensee is unavailable to have the photograph made. Wait, this seems very accommodating to certain groups of people. So where's the restriction? Well, this special license is not valid for federal identification purposes or voter identification purposes. So does this mean that you're prohibited from voting if you don't have one of these special licenses? Of course not, because you have other options, including getting a free Arkansas voter ID card. Now, the Brennan Center could empower voters by informing them that they can use one of a myriad of other documents to vote with, but instead, they'd rather paint you as a victim. Also in Arkansas is a provision that if you cast a provisional ballot or absentee ballot without ID, that you have until the Monday after the election to go to the County Board of Elections and fix it. Otherwise, your vote isn't counted. So even though Arkansas allows you to vote on election day without an ID and gives you a week to show identification, Arkansas is somehow infringing on your right to vote? Give me a frickin' break. In Florida, the new law requires that if a voter makes an in-person or telephonic response for a mail-in ballot, that the elector must provide their Florida driver's license number, Florida identification card number, or the last 4 digits of their social security number. You mean they make you verify your information to vote? Damn you, Ron DeSantis! In Georgia, the new law requires that when a voter applies for an absentee by mail ballot, they have to write the number of their Georgia driver's license number or identification card. And if they don't have any of those, they need to place a photocopy of any one of these in an envelope. And according to the Georgia Secretary of State, there are only 9,000 Georgia voters who don't have driver's licenses or state ID, and yet somehow these people are able to cast a ballot. But my voter suppression! In Montana, the revised voter identification laws actually add additional forms of ID. If you don't have a government-issued ID, you can now use any other form of photo identification and a current utility bill, bank statement, paycheck, government check, or other government document that shows the individual's name or current address. And then there's Texas. And for this one, let's go to soon-be Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer.
The Houston Chronicle reported that, quote, county officials in urban areas across the state of Texas say they've been forced to reject an unprecedented number of mail ballot applications, thanks to the new Republican voter suppression law.
According to that Houston Chronicle article, the new law, which Democrats decried as an attempt to suppress the votes of minority groups, requires male voters to give their driver's license number or state ID number. In the absence of those, they can provide the last 4 digits of their social security number or indicate they do not have the required IDs. So Democrats like Chuck Schumer are saying that minority groups are incapable of getting driver's licenses, state IDs, social security numbers, or copies of utility bills, paychecks, or even birth certificates. And if you actually read the article, the reason is that most of the rejected applications were lacking any ID information from the voter. And the rejected applications are only in the hundreds, and each county is required by law to reach out to every applicant and try and fix the issue, so technically they aren't even rejected yet. Next, the Brennan Center lists 7 states that have expanded voter purges or supposedly increase the risk of faulty voter purges. First of all, these are not purges. That's a derogatory term that the Democrats use to describe when states maintain their voter lists. If a person is not voted in a primary or a general election in 4 years or more, federal law, specifically the National Voter Registration Act, allows for their removal from the list. In other words, that category is bullshit. So we'll just move on. Next is the accusation that 3 states are increasing barriers for voters with disabilities. In Alabama, the state banned curbside voting and prohibits the removal of a voting machine or ballot from the designated polling place for the purpose of voting. In a statement from Governor Kay Ivey, handicap-accessible voting machines will still be available at all polling places and absentee offices. All polling places in the state are required to be ADA compliant, and voters with qualifying disabilities may also apply for an absentee ballot. In 2020, an advocacy group sued Alabama over the curbside voting ban, and the case made its way to the Supreme Court, which ruled in a 5-3 decision that banning curbside voting, a thing that didn't exist before the pandemic, wasn't discriminatory in any way. And again, people with qualifying disabilities can vote by mail. Problem solved. And these two laws in Iowa and Texas prevent ballot harvesting groups to pick up ballots from disabled voters, which to Democrats is apparently discriminatory or something. So that brings us to Texas House Bill 3920, which added additional language to their election code. Voters are not eligible for an absentee ballot who have a sickness that does not prevent the voter from appearing at the polling place on election day without a likelihood of needing personal assistance or of injuring the voter's health. And then on the ballot by mail application, you have to check this box affirming your reason. In other words, there is nothing in that language that is preventing anyone who is disabled from voting absentee. Next on the list is probably the most infamous and most repeated restriction ever.
If you give somebody a drink of water standing in line, it's a felony.
Yeah, he's lying. It's not illegal to give someone a drink of water, but it is illegal, as it is in many, many states, to solicit voters right before they vote. Florida law states that no person, political committee, or other group or organization may solicit voters inside the polling place or within 150 feet of a drop box or the entrance to any polling place, and so on and so forth. And if you read the actual law, it doesn't say anything specifically about handing out snacks or drink. It's simply a blanket rule that is designed to stop electioneering. The law added this text, which allows for election staff to give out items, which could include water, to voters without penalty. So while Florida's law on electioneering could be a little too broad, in Georgia, it's a lot more specific. No person shall give, offer to give, or participate in the giving of any money or gifts, including but not limited to food and drink, to an elector within 150 feet of the outer edge of any building within which a polling place is established or within any polling place. And I've covered the Georgia law to death, but they specifically list food or drink in the law because campaign staff and candidates have been caught electioneering under the guise of, we just want to help the nice people.
If you give somebody a drink of water standing in line, it's a felony.
Actually, it's not a felony. In Florida and Georgia, soliciting voters waiting in line to vote is a misdemeanor. But it's really great to know that Jim Clyburn, federal lawmaker, either didn't read the actual law or did read it and is lying to you.
That is crazy.
Next on the list is the accusation that states are making voter registration more difficult. In Iowa, Senate File 413, each commissioner shall conduct a systematic program that makes a reasonable effort to remove from the official list of registered voters the names of registered voters who have changed residence from their registration addresses. Each registered voter who has not voted in the most recent general election shall be marked inactive. Being marked inactive doesn't remove a registered voter from a list. All it is a possible indication suggesting that a voter may have changed residence, died, etc. Next on the list is Senate Bill 90 in Florida that requires renewing your mail-in ballot request every 2 years, which we went over already. In Kansas, no person shall mail or cause to be mailed an application for an advance voting ballot unless such person is a resident of this state or is otherwise domiciled in this state. So what this means is that if you're a nonpartisan advocacy group that is not based in Kansas, you're not allowed to send mail-in ballot applications to registered voters in Kansas. Not allowing out-of-state political operatives to send ballots to specific people, i.e. not registered Republicans, isn't making it harder for people to register to vote. If a voter needs an application, they can get one themselves. It's not hard. Then there's 3, count 'em 3, voter suppression laws in Montana. House Bill 176 tweaked the law, saying that late registration ends at noon the day before an election. House Bill 169 forces voter registration applicants who only have a student ID as identification to also include a current utility bill, bank statement, paycheck, government check, or other government document that shows the individual's name and current address. Critics say that this is restrictive against students and young people. However, most of these students will have a social security number. And on the voter registration application, applicants can write down the last 4 digits of their social security number. And Montana Senate Bill 319 prohibits political activity, including voter registration drives, inside any residence hall, dining facility, or athletic facility operated by a public post-secondary institution. Now, obviously, you can register to vote outside of these selected locations at a public university. Now, while some critics might say that the law infringes on students' First Amendment rights, it's very clear that this law isn't making it harder for anyone to register to vote. Next is House Bill 523 in New Hampshire, and honestly, it might be my favorite of the bunch. This bill requires voters who register to vote using a qualified voter affidavit or sworn statement on the Election Day registration form, instead of using other approved identification, to have their photograph taken at the time of registration. In other words, if you don't have a proper ID, you can still register to vote on Election Day, but you will need to have your photo taken. And this is the best part. The bill lays out how much it will cost and which cameras to buy. The Department of State indicates this bill will require that a Polaroid-style camera and film be purchased by the state for each of 330 polling places. The department estimates each camera would cost $80, and the film for each camera would cost $20. Total expenditure for year 2022 is estimated at $33,000, and the total expenditure for year 2024 for replacement film is $3,300. So according to the Brennan Center, taking a Polaroid of a person who has no ID, therefore allowing them to register to vote on Election Day, is restrictive. And finally, in Texas, a person may not establish residence for the purpose of influencing the outcome of a certain election. Pretty self-explanatory. No wonder Democrats hate it. Next, there are 3 states that have supposedly reduced polling place availability. In Iowa, polling places close at 8 p.m. instead of 9 p.m. And there's 20 days of early voting, so not restrictive. In Montana, polling places are open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., except for polling places having fewer than 400 registered voters who intend to vote at the polling place. Those must be open from at least noon to 8 p.m. Now, admittedly, cutting back hours might sound restrictive unless you know anything about Montana. According to the 2020 Election Administration and Voting Survey, in 2020, only 9,497 voters voted in person on Election Day in the entire state. The rest, almost 600,000, voted absentee by mail or took part in in-person absentee voting, i.e. 30 days of early voting. And considering that Montana has the 3rd highest voter turnout among active registered voters in the country, I think they know what they're doing. And in Texas, long story short, they banned 24-hour voting. Wow, you can't vote 24 hours a day. The founding fathers must be rolling in their f***ing graves. Next, there's Senate Bill 84 in Nevada, which increased the number of voters per precinct. The new law states election precincts must be established on the basis of the number of registered voters therein, and raised the maximum from 3,000 to 5,000 active registered voters. And I would like to point out that Nevada has a Democrat-controlled legislature and a Democrat governor that signed this restrictive bill into law. Not restrictive, by the way. And the final category, restrictive laws that limit early voting days or hours. Georgia's Senate Bill 202 actually expanded early voting and is now a minimum of 17 days. And in Texas, as I mentioned before, Senate Bill 1 banned that ridiculous 24-hour voting. That leaves Iowa, who in February 2021 reduced the period for in-person absentee voting, i.e. early voting, from 29 days to 20 days. And that was the last one, guys. We did it. We went down the entire list. So now I have to ask you this. Did you see it? Did you see all the voter suppression? Well, of course you didn't, because it doesn't exist, no matter what Joe Biden tells you.
Well, I think if, in fact, no matter how hard they make it for minorities to vote, I think you're going to see them willing to stand in line and defy the attempt to keep them from being able to vote.
But I thought you said that minorities couldn't vote or something. Whatever. And on that stupid note, thanks for watching. Be sure that you're still subscribed to the channel. And as always, I hope to see you next time. If there is a next time.